and welcome to the Debrief. We're back after about a 2-week hiatus. Thanks for sticking with us. We got a lot of news coming this week. This is Carolina Journal's weekly recap of everything happening in public policy and politics in North Carolina. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal. Joining us this week, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation is here, plus Alex Belziger, who's been covering the state legislature for us this session. Also, David Bass covering all things education for Carolina Journal, and Brooke Medina joining us from the John Locke Foundation. We have a lot to talk about this week, but we're going to start with new district maps coming from North Carolina. New redistricting maps have been released. House, Senate, Congressional. Alex has been covering this. Tell us, what does this mean for 2024, and break down these numbers for us and explain these maps.
Sure, so it means a lot. I'll start with the congressional maps. So 2 congressional maps were released, so it's a little bit unclear as to what we will end up with exactly.
Sure.
But one of the versions was really, really bad for Democrats, and then the other version was just really bad for Democrats. So essentially, the one version is an 11-3. That's the really, really bad version.
Okay.
It's 11-3 Republican map, and the 3 Democrats who would remain in office are Alma Adams, Deborah Ross, and Valerie Foushee or Don Davis. So they basically merge them, and
Okay.
they're going to have to.
The 2.
They get double bunked.
Okay.
So that's the really, really bad one. The other one, which we can put up here on the screen.
This is just really bad, not really, really bad.
This is just really bad. I personally believe this is more like what we'll end up with. That's what I'm hearing. But on the western side of the state, that far left one is Chuck Edwards' seat.
Okay.
That 14 seat is where Jeff Jackson is going to be removed from, because that is now a Republican seat. And then I've heard speculation Tim Moore may want to run there. Pat Harrigan has already declared for that seat. If you move up a little bit, Virginia Fox is that 5th district. I assume she'll still...
That yellow?
Yep, that yellow one
Okay.
up there. 10 is going to be Patrick McHenry, the green one there.
Okay.
6 is going to be kind of an open seat, and I've heard names like Mark Walker might consider dropping out of the governor's race
the pink.
and running. Yep,
Okay.
a pink one. 12 is the Alma Adams seat. If you move down to 8, that is also a new seat. And that would have been Dan Bishop's seat, but he's obviously declared he's going to run for the Attorney General spot. And so I've heard Mark Harris is going to run for that seat. I've also heard Alan Bauckham is going to run. And then I've heard a few other names floated, including Tricia Cotham, who may be considering a run for Congress, but I've not talked to her about that. 9 is going to be the Richard Hudson seat. He had moved to Moore County, and I believe he's going to continue to live there. If you move over to 4, that's going to be the Valerie Foushee seat.
Okay.
Now, 2 is going to be Deborah Ross. 13 is where it also gets interesting. That is also probably the most interesting looking district.
Sure.
But
That's the green, right?
That's the green one that goes all the way around Wake County.
Okay.
I've heard a lot of different names floated for running there. Aaron Perret, I think, is considering that one. I've heard Fred Von Cannon is considering that one. I've heard a number of other names. I don't want to list them all because I'll forget some people.
Sure.
And if you move up into the northeast side, that District 1 there is where Don Davis currently represents, Democrat Don Davis. And that one is going to be the only swing district under these maps. So that one really could go either way. It might be a point or 2 Democratic as of now, but we'll see in 2024. 3 will be that's the Greg Murphy seat, and then if you move down to that red district, that'll be David Rouser's seat, I believe. So.
Okay.
And that is the congressional map as we most know it, but we'll see what happens. They're still debating exactly where these lines are going to be. It could be totally different by the time it actually comes out. But then if we move over to the state Senate map.
Right.
I won't walk you through every single district.
Right.
But the top line numbers, basically if you assume that the party that won in 2022 in the U.S. Senate race between Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley, if they won it by more than 5 points, if we go ahead and give the race to that party,
right.
The Republicans would win 29 out of 50 seats.
Okay.
The Democrats would win 17 seats, and then there'd be 4 swing seats. So there'd be 4 races that would be projected to be in the swing category.
What would it take to keep that supermajority?
So it takes 30 to keep a supermajority. So Republicans are they're going to be close at 29.
Sure.
They're only going to have to win one of the 4 swing seats under those assumptions.
Okay.
And then the state house map is a little bit similar. It takes 72 for Republicans to get a supermajority. They have 67 of those seats that would fall under the same qualification, being greater than a 5% win in 2022. And then Democrats have 44 safe seats, whereas 9 total seats would be in the swing category. And so Republicans would need to win 5 out of those 9 swing seats in order to get a supermajority.
All right. So tell me the process from here. I know that we had some hearings today, on Thursday, probably more coming next week. No votes this week, maybe votes next week?
Great question. So the maps were released yesterday, and then we heard from Representative Destin Hall, who chairs the House Election and Redistricting Committee, that maps are going to be voted on. House maps are going to be voted on in the House on Tuesday.
All right.
And then the House is going to vote on the Senate and Congressional maps on Wednesday. And I don't remember what Chairman Heiss said, but I believe the Senate will probably do something similar.
Sure. That is a lot of information in a short period of time. That's why you're good at what you do. Mitch, one of the things that Senator Heiss said during the hearings on Thursday, he said that racial data was not used in formulating these maps, but political data was. Explain to me what he means and why that's important.
Well, first of all, you have to know that the entire redistricting process in North Carolina is a bit of a kabuki dance because of all of the lawsuits that have been filed for decades. There are a lot of things that have to be done in redistricting because of the way various state and federal legal cases have played out. Now, one of the things that old redistricting rulings have said is that if you're drawing an election map, you have to draw districts that are needed to comply with the Voting Rights Act first. And to do that, you would have to have racial data about where African Americans, in our case, in other states sometimes it's Latinos, but in our case it's mainly African Americans, where they live, so you can determine whether you need a Voting Rights Act district, and then you draw that first, and then you draw the rest of the map. Now, Democrats, in their initial reaction to this, are saying, look, you didn't do any of this, you didn't draw Voting Rights Act districts. And what the Republicans are saying, and Destin Hall alluded to this, and Ralph Heiss talked about it, is the most recent rulings have said if you don't have any evidence in the record of racially polarized voting, then you shouldn't take race into account at all. And they have not done that in their last batch of maps during this decade. They've not taken race into account. Now, one thing Destin Hall did say is after a request from some of the left of center organizations, they are going to put the racial data in, but they said they didn't consider that. The consultant they hired to draw the maps didn't consider race at all, and so that's something that they definitely didn't do. They did add political data, which was something they didn't do in the last round of redistricting, but since the state Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court have come out and said, we're not going to deal with any partisan gerrymandering cases anymore. This is a political issue. This is the type of thing that can be incorporated into a map. They've said, okay, the courts have said we can use political data. We're going to do it. So they did, and that's why they're saying no racial data, no political data. Before you move on, the one other thing I wanted to mention, because we have to be careful about this, and I think this is something that politicos have a problem with, is that they'll look at the map and they'll say, this is an 11-3 Republican map, or this is a 10-4 Republican map, this is a 30-20 or a 29-21 Republican map on the Senate side, or 71-72 Republican map on the House side. That is all based on what's happened in the past and predictions of what is likely to happen in the future. All of these races are going to be contested between 2 or more candidates in a district, and you don't know how the districts are going to play out. You could set the stage so that you think the maps are going to tell you how many people are going to win in particular elections, but elections determine this. Elections decided between people, and that's why when there's going to be criticism that, oh, this is a 10-4 map or an 11-3 map, no, it's a map that makes it likely that based on what happened in the past, you might get 10 Republicans and 4 Democrats, but it will all be determined by who runs. Republicans easily could have had an 8-6 majority in this past congressional map. But there was one race, the 13th, between Wiley Nickel and Bo Hines, where in a sure toss-up, the Democrats won. Candidates matter, and so the maps don't determine everything.
Sure. Well, in 2010, I guess, Republicans won on a Democrat.
Right. That was a map that the maps that Democrats had drawn and Republicans really swept and basically almost turned mirror image in both the House and Senate of the advantages that Democrats had had because of the way the political winds had shifted. And so if it's an incredibly good Democratic year, that doesn't mean that Republicans are going to control they certainly wouldn't get super majorities, and they might not even control the entire chamber in either the House or the Senate if it's an incredibly good Democratic year. Sure. Candidates matter, the issues matter, the maps aren't the be-all and end-all of what happens.
That's such an important point to make. And now that said, we're all watching Wake and Mecklenburg because those areas tend to be heavily populated. They tend to vote blue, but maybe not as much this time around.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, thanks to Alex's great reporting,
Sure.
I think we saw that, for example, in Wake County, right now there are 6 Senate seats.
Okay.
And all 6 of those are Democrats. I think under the new proposed maps, though, 2 of those seats could be a little bit more competitive.
Okay.
So that's just interesting to see an urban center like Wake County that's a Democrat stronghold even could be a little bit contested. I think some of how they did that was draw in some, support from like Granville County or other areas
Sure.
to kind of influence what was going on in Wake.
So suburbs are important.
The suburbs are really important. Same kind of story in Mecklenburg County where it's a little bit more competitive there as well. So I found that interesting coming out of this process how 2 of the kind of Democratic strongholds, there's been a little bit of a, chipping away at that
Sure.
with this.
Have you seen any reaction on Capitol Hill to these maps from our delegation?
The interesting thing was, the maps are fresh out, and
Sure.
immediately Jeff Jackson, 12th District, he took to TikTok and Twitter immediately and said, "I'm toast. I'm history." And so everyone's assuming, where he's going to go next, potential to jump into the Attorney General's race here.
Sure.
And go up against Dan Bishop potentially in that race. So that could be a very interesting statewide race for local here.
Yeah,
in North
he's
Carolina.
a big TikTok guy, so this would be a social media race,
For sure.
I think, for sure. But this isn't going to be the end of it. That something you and I have talked about. The lawsuits sometimes make run the table occasionally.
Yeah, well, and to Mitch's point earlier regarding lawsuits, a lot of them have rested on the Voting Rights Act, for example, and a lot of the claims have resided there. So something I think might be kind of interesting to watch just over the years, I would say generationally, thinking about how North Carolina right now, the white population has decreased from 65 to about 60%. So as we become more multi-ethnic, multi-race here in the state, as well as across the U.S., just millennials, Gen Z, they're far more racially diverse than previous generations. I do wonder how tenable that particular argument is going to be as just people identify as more than one race. So I think that what we're seeing now might not play out 20 years from now. It'll just be interesting to watch that. But I also just, as an aside, the whole Jeff Jackson TikTok, I think he is going to capitalize on this
Sure.
on social media and certainly use that maybe to fuel some more visibility as he perhaps enters the AG race.
Very interesting. We'll be watching that really closely. Back to you, Mitch, actually. One of the things you and I have talked a lot about are these lawsuits that have been filed here lately. Of course, there is no shortage of lawsuits, particularly on election issues. As we now look at the maps, we look toward 2024. What happened this week? Governor Cooper's filing a suit again.
Yeah, all kinds of suits. And once these maps are finalized, we'll probably
Sure.
officially be in election lawsuit season because there will be at least one and probably multiple lawsuits about these maps that are filed. And much of what you're seeing in the General Assembly this week and next will be people setting the stage for the lawsuits. In fact,
Okay.
I watched some of that meeting with Destin Hall, and almost every question that came from a Democrat is something that's going to be in a lawsuit. I mean,
Okay.
that's just the way that it's going to play out. But we got a preview of lawsuit season based on some other things that have been passed. The General Assembly overrode the governor's veto on a bill that would make some election reforms. They also overrode his veto on a bill that would change the State Board of Elections to make that an even 4-4 Democrat-Republican board rather than now a 3-2 board, with the 3 being held by the governor's party, so now by the Democrats. Governor Cooper has filed suit in state court over both of those things. He doesn't want to see the elections board change. Actually, his second suit in state court was over a different bill that was about changing appointment powers, once again taking away some of his powers. But we've seen 3 different federal lawsuits filed over the election reform bill. One was by a group of activists and a couple of individuals, students at Duke and Appalachian State, who are working with Mark Elias, the Democratic super lawyer who's been working on cases like this for years and years. Another one was filed by the Democratic National Committee and the State Democratic Party. A third one was filed by Democracy North Carolina. They're challenging some of the same things in the different suits. One of them deals with the change with the way same-day registration would operate. There's a particular piece of that they don't like, dealing with you go in to register on the same day, the Board of Elections sends you a piece of mail. Right now, they have to send 2 pieces of mail, and if neither of them come back, they can drop you and not count your ballot. Now the change would be they send you 1 piece of mail, the mail is returned, they can not count your ballot, and the lawsuits are arguing that's unconstitutional. There's some other challenges to some changes in the date when an absentee ballot can be counted if it's mailed in. Right now there's a 3-day grace period after Election Day. The new law says the ballot has to get there by the end of the day, actually by the end of the closing of the filing or the voting deadline on Election Day, so 7:30 that night. Another piece is changes in election observers and what they're allowed to do, and that's something that's being changed in those lawsuits. So all of those are filed. And then another piece that's outside of elections, but it's also related to what the General Assembly just did. One of the other vetoes was on the bill that would ban the gender surgery for minors, and a group has filed a federal lawsuit on that. And if you actually look at the case numbers that are filed, 3 of the 4 numbers in consecutive order are the federal lawsuits against elections and against that bill to deal with the gender surgery. So lots of lawsuits, expect more to come. It's going to make all of these lawyers very rich men and women and keep them very busy and keep the courts busy.
Sure. So this seems to be, same story, different year with the lawsuits. Do you feel like lawmakers were ready for this? Were they expecting this to come?
Well, I saw a quote from somebody on Twitter earlier that there are 3 things that are sure in life: death, taxes, and North Carolina redistricting lawsuits.
Okay.
And there's obviously a lot of other lawsuits going on too, but I know for sure lawmakers usually know what to expect with regard to when their legislation is going to provoke lawsuits from the left.
Okay.
And so a lot of times, if somebody is targeting the state and the Democratic Attorney General Josh Stein doesn't want to take it up, I know Moore and Berger will add themselves to the case just to defend their legislation. So, yeah, they're very invested, and I think they anticipated just about all of these lawsuits.
Well, that's a good question,
and in fact, in all of these election reform lawsuits, the defendants are not Phil Berger and Tim Moore, who were the ones leading the chambers to pass the laws. The defendants are the members and the director of the State Board of Elections, who are now 3-2 Democrats and are somewhat aligned, at least, with the Democratic Party. And there is some concern that there could be some collusion here.
Sure.
That sue the people who are on your side so you can get a deal, which is why Berger and Moore have filed to intervene to defend their laws.
Right. It is interesting because this has come up before, this idea of collusion, that the Attorney General, and then it was Roy Cooper before that, would not defend the laws of the Republican legislature. So these, no collusion bills have had difficulty getting through the governor's office.
It's a weird process, when we're talking about state actors too, because these are not people with anything at stake. Like, they don't have personal stake in losing. Right. And so it is interesting that you have to think about the calculus of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting. So, Brooke, do you think that this is more of that sue till it's blue strategy?
Oh yes, I mean they're going to continue that playbook until they can't anymore. But North Carolina, I mean, it is a purple state in a lot of ways. Oftentimes it does lean right. We've got Republican supermajorities right now, but I even think Republicans typically don't take things for granted. And so the Democrat strategy, when you don't hold those particular institutions like the legislature, is to go through the judiciary and continue to sue and continue to raise money off of that, I would say too. It is a great sort of campaign to mobilize the public, the activists, and so certainly I would say until Democrats get in power again, if they do, which we always know the political winds turn and they blow
Right.
every which way. And so until then, they're probably going to rely on this strategy. And then it'll be interesting to see, do the Republicans take on the strategy maybe when they're in the minority?
Right. I mean, it's a communication strategy. I mean, this is what
It certainly
this
is.
is what you're very aware of, right?
I mean,
Yeah.
that whole county provision that we know about in
Sure.
redistricting came about because of a Republican lawsuit against Democratic gerrymandering 20 years ago.
Sure. Very interesting.
The more things change, the more they stay the same,
That's
right?
exactly right. That's exactly right. Speaking of which, we're going to shift gears a little bit. David, you were covering an alarming report, actually, that came out of the State Auditor's office about North Carolina public schools and truancy. This seems like more collateral damage from COVID. Tell us what it found.
Yeah, absolutely. So State Auditor Beth Wood's office went and examined 6 North Carolina school districts. And basically they were just looking at, during kind of the depths of COVID,
Sure.
what the truancy rates were, so the rate of students absent who were enrolled who didn't actually show up to class.
Okay.
And what they found was that in most of the school districts, the school district wasn't able to provide enough information to really make a determination on it.
So you're not really even tracking?
Yeah,
That's what it seems
apparently,
like.
and
Yeah.
so only one school district was able to, and that was Henderson County Schools out in the western North Carolina.
Right.
And we have the numbers up there. What they found was about 13% of students were truant during the year.
Okay.
I think that was, alarming, but
Sure.
the interesting thing was, of those, 80, 90%, they still promoted to the next grade and or graduated them from high school. So I think it was a situation where just move them through, try to get through the crisis as much as possible.
Sure.
So I think that's interesting, but what also is alarming is the fact that there wasn't more readily available information, I think, on the truancy rates in a
Right.
lot of these school districts. Superintendent Catherine Truitt had a response where she really blistered the state auditor's office, said this was a misuse of taxpayer dollars to do this. It was
Okay.
not done correctly. So there's that conflict between those two offices at this
Sure.
point. I think at a base level, though, it's very interesting to see and concerning to see some of the results that came
It
out
really
on
is.
this.
It really is. I mean, you're a mom like me, and I know from what I've seen anecdotally among my children's friends that a lot of times they're allowed to make up work, and if you send in a note, it's excused, and all these other kind of absences have muddied the waters a bit on truancy.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It has muddied the waters. I would think it has certainly made academic standards and even expectations of attending class in person very elastic.
Right.
And so it's just like, well, it's available on Zoom. Think about even in our professional lives where it's just like, is the conference in person and on Zoom? Well, I might choose one or the other. Now, granted, that's not the case right now. The students are just flat out missing classes. And
Sure.
that number that you pointed out was really concerning. Up to 90% of them are still being moved on to the next grade. And that's, I mean, it's a parental issue. Where are your children at? Are you making sure they're in school? But it's also a school issue. How are we, what kind of disservice did we do to kids by pushing them out of the classroom for so long and then expecting them to just bounce right back? And I think that this is an echo of that challenge that we experienced over COVID.
Yeah, I think so too. Alex, what are your thoughts about this? Your generation is going to be used to being on Zoom, going to be used to attending meetings remotely, going to class remotely. I just don't think you get the same experience. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you on that.
Okay.
But I don't know if my generation would agree with me
Really?
on
You don't
that.
think?
I think for the most part, people are very happy that people love working from home now. They almost expect it when they get a new job. They expect at least part of their job to be working from
Right.
home. So I'm very curious as this generation gets older and
Right.
older, if the amount of work that they're producing stays constant or if,
Right, just
if
like
it
in
dips
school.
a bit. Yes, exactly. And we've seen it in school, and I think that is a good sort of experiment for seeing what happens when kids are on Zoom versus in person. I think the same thing can be applied to the workforce. I think when you're on Zoom all the time, there can definitely be a drop in productivity.
Very interesting. What are your thoughts on this?
I think Brooke hit the nail on the head when she talked about this being an echo of the COVID pandemic. I think
Sure.
we're still seeing the signs of that. It's not the case that we closed down the schools, had that problem, and then reopened them and everything went back to normal. It didn't get back
Right.
to normal, and there are a lot of families and a lot of students still struggling with,
Yeah.
are you in school, are you out of school, are you online, are you not online, how far behind are you? And I think that's something that we're not only dealing with now, but probably will be dealing with for years to come.
Right. Is there data reflecting that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think we've seen recent test results.
Sure.
The most recent set of data show that we are kind of recovering some from that.
Okay.
But the previous 2 years, I mean, we saw that students were really struggling on end of grade testing. And obviously there have been academic consequences, social consequences as well. It was obviously not very well thought through in the middle of the crisis how this would actually impact students and families. It's had a really bad effect.
Yeah, it is alarming. Now, talking about students, I'm going to switch also to what we've seen happening on campuses with protests about the violent attacks against Israel on October 7th, this horrific violence. But now we're seeing pro-Palestinian protests on campuses right here in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. And they're calling it pro-Palestine protests, but I would say a lot of the ways in which they have messaged it have been pro-Hamas.
Right.
And there's a difference there, right?
Sure.
And so I think that distinction is being lost when on the tails of Hamas attacks, thousands of Israelis and Palestinians are being murdered and slaughtered, and Hamas is hiding behind them, and yet there are UNC students with these rallies, and we're going to see the footage on that as well as the tweet of the week related to this. They're openly calling for this these attacks to continue until Israel is no longer a state, and this is happening. Of course, it's easy for them to call for this. UNC is the fourth top public university in the country. A lot of the people who attend, they sit in a very comfortable position, and they're probably going to move on to the elite workforce, a white-collar one, and they spend their time doing this. There are people suffering across the world over here. And so it's disheartening to see this. If you look at the flyer and the tweet of the week that
All right, so that video that you were seeing was a Jewish professor that was trying to get into a building, and it happened to be a protest happening there in front. He was being harassed on campus. This is just startling to me, what we're seeing in this video of this professor trying to get into his building. Why is it that you can misgender somebody and get in trouble, but you can harass a Jewish professor on campus right in the middle? This seems not free speech, but preferred speech. Somehow anti-Semitism has become a protected speech.
It's alarming. Just with the quickness of it, and we're seeing it all across globally. We're seeing it, but to see it here in North Carolina, right around the corner from us in Chapel Hill, at a public university, there is this harassment. There is this increasing acceptance of anti-Semitism being some sort of speech issue. And again, the UNC system, for example, it's worth noting they have not taken a public stance on this issue because this summer the legislature passed a bill that required neutrality among universities regarding political issues of the day.
I think this has now provided them a shield when they don't want to talk about it. Who decides what controversial is?
Yeah, that was my exact thought. Is who makes that determine? No, it's fine. You took the words from it. No, who decides what's controversial on these sorts of things? One interesting thing I think too about this is a lot of these students are coming out to protest. I think you would see them coming out just to name one issue on protesting on women's rights here in the United States. And you want to look at actual real women's rights issues in the Middle East. It's this bizarre mixture, inconsistency on those sorts of things. So it's just another example of the craziness in our politics right now.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, one of CJ's former interns, Grant Lefflar, has the tweet of the week today because he was there for the protest that we're talking about. Alex, tell me, you reported a great, interesting story, really broke some news about a resolution on Israel passed in the North Carolina House.
So interestingly, we saw similar sentiment from some in our state legislature, obviously not as near violent as these interactions were, but there was a resolution in the state house just to basically support Israel after Hamas had slaughtered like
Sure.
600 plus Israelis in Israel. And it was just a simple resolution. It basically said, we support Israel, we condemn Hamas for the violence, and North Carolina offers their support to Israel. And 1/4 of the Democratic House caucus walked out on
Got
that
up and
vote.
walked out.
They got out and walked out. It wasn't like a dramatic scene where they did it in unison. They just kind of snuck out so that they couldn't vote on it.
Sure.
And then I think they thought that was better than voting no. But obviously it blew up quite a bit in the media,
Right.
and they all had to answer for it. Pretty much almost every one of them released a statement saying, a lot of them said, I support Israel, but like I didn't like that we didn't mention Palestinians, something to that effect. There were varying statements.
Sure.
And then on the Senate side, they didn't do a resolution, they did a letter in
Okay.
support of Israel, so it was more sentimental. But there were 4 Democrats on the Senate side who refused to sign it.
Wow, that is interesting. Do you think that the universities, I'm wondering about this effort to try and stay relatively neutral on this issue, even when you're seeing people slaughtered for their race and their religion. Do you think the universities really need to provide more moral clarity? What are your thoughts on this? The universities are in a tough spot when they are in the middle of something like this.
Well, it is a tough spot, and I think, as you said, that one of the things that was part of that neutrality piece that was passed earlier was you didn't want the university to get involved in things that are woke or crazy left, but that's also going to make them gun-shy about trying to provide moral clarity on something that almost all of us should agree, and that is that innocents shouldn't be slaughtered.
Right.
I think that's going to make it tough for them. One piece of potentially good news to me comes out of what is in most respects bad news, and that is all of us who've been through college remember that there is a protest crowd and there is a group of people that's the vast majority of students who don't pay any attention to them.
Right.
And my hope is that most of the students at the UNC Chapel Hill campus looked at this and said, oh, there's just the crazy protesters again, and ignore them.
Right.
Now that doesn't mean that we should ignore the fact that there are people who are calling for these far left fringe ideas of basically getting rid of Israel and returning Palestine to all Arabs, which is basically the pro-Palestine argument and has been since 1947.
Sure.
We should be concerned about that, but I think we should also remember that probably most students at UNC Chapel Hill just looked at it and said, that's noise, I'm going to be focusing on my classwork or my fraternity and sorority or the next football game.
Sure.
And that'll probably be good news in the long term.
Sure.
I might actually disagree with you to some
Really?
extent in your
All right.
hopefulness, because I think there is maybe some truth to that, but I think what these protests do, and I've seen this with other people who don't necessarily have a strong stance one way or another, but it almost legitimizes the one side. And so then they think, oh, that looks controversial, I don't want to weigh in one way or the other.
Right.
So a lot of people who would be considered more mainstream, who might typically take like Israel's side, for example, might all of a sudden be 50-50 on the issue.
Sure.
Is what I've seen, and I think a lot of people my age are they're more skeptical of politics, they don't have hard stances as much, they get scared to weigh in on something because of the blowback that could happen from
Sure.
it, so
Sure.
that's something that I've seen.
Yeah, this actually instance, Brooke, I'm going to come back to you for a second, has really shown how powerful TikTok is. Even my teenage daughter brought me her phone and said, what is going on? Because they didn't understand what it was. They're seeing horrific images coming out, and it's being posted live, in many cases, by those who are committing these atrocities.
Yeah, I mean, that alone, the fact that our children are exposed to it, the children in Israel, in Palestine, the Gaza Strip, in the Gaza Strip area, it's just, this is real life.
Sure.
These people are living through horror. And there is the benefit of social media to make people aware of what's going on, and it can awaken our moral conscience. But there are times when there is a cynicism that is growing, and when people are afraid to weigh in on something controversial that seems like it's out of the mainstream, it can serve to stifle them. Or if they're seeing stuff go viral that is maybe pro one side of this movement, and there's something inside of them that says maybe that's not right, but it begins to, the algorithms feed this sort of cycle of celebrating maybe a particular side of this argument. Sure. And so it makes it can kind of muffle the moral clarity that we should be hearing, which is where grown-ups are supposed to step in and say, here's the moral clarity that your generation maybe doesn't have yet because you haven't been through this yet, but here's how you need to approach this. So it's good that, parents, if you're watching this, talk to your kids about what's going on. They're going to have questions because they are seeing it online. My kids see it as well.
Yeah.
We have to have these hard talks.
You can't shield them from this. If they have a phone, they have access to social media, they've seen these images. It is alarming. It is. All right, well, that's about all the time we have for this week on The Debrief. Make sure that you subscribe. We'll be coming to you every week with the latest of what's happening in Raleigh and your state government. And make sure you check out carolinajournal.com for all the latest news. Thanks so much.